So now I'm just going to go along the row here and ask them each to offer us some thoughts in response to what George had to say, and then we'll open up to a wider conversation. So Tess.
Hi everyone, great to be here. So first of all, I would like to say a big thank you to George and the Lancet Commission for doing this work. As a recent survivor of adolescence, I suppose you could say, it's humbling and it's lovely to hear that people are, in my opinion, finally taking notice. For me, my overwhelming impression to begin with was just how big the burden of mental distress, substance abuse, substance misuse, and sort of NCDs, non-communicable diseases, are in developed countries like Australia, but also around the world. In the work that I do in global mental health, which is about mental health in developing countries, it quite often exists that you have adolescents or youth who are dealing with both communicable disease or HIV infection at the same time as they're dealing with mental distress. So that for me is a big take-home message. The second thing I would say is, as growing up as a female in Australia, I'm also can see the benefits that I've sort of reaped from this delay in marriage and having children, and the ability to educate myself further and to focus on my career and, I suppose, individuality. But importantly, that is a privilege that many people around the world and in Australia don't have, and to be really mindful of that and, I suppose, to work towards changing that. The other thing would be the profound effect of technology. So Emma and I have grown up entirely surrounded by social media, the internet, and it's interesting to reflect on that, the impact that can have in a positive way, so connecting people, to reducing barriers to access of healthcare, so through e-health technologies and stuff, but also how isolating that can be, particularly looking at the sort of curation of people's social media profiles and the sort of excessive energy that can be spent doing that and the impact on mental health. And finally, I would say the exciting part for me, which I touched on before, is the recommendation from the report to have more of an emphasis on youth participation. So I work in the mental health sector, and there's definitely been a strong movement towards having consumer-centered or user-centered design and implementation of programs. So it's nice to see that this principle it's a rights-based principle, basically, that's being applied to adolescents.
So when you say user-centered design, you mean adolescents involved in designing the services they get rather than just being experts from outside telling them what's good for them, that sort of thing. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Alex.
Thank you, Peter. Again, many thanks. It's a pleasure to be here. The report is a global report looking at adolescents globally, and as I take the lens from Africa and see what the issues are with adolescents in that region, I think one of the clear things that emerging, which is clear in the report, is this is we have the largest proportion of the population that's within this age group. And whatever is going on with them has huge implications as to where Africa ends up 10, 15, 20 years down the road. Are we making the right investments in their lives? And this is really one of the biggest things. Presidents of many African countries, as they grapple with the issue of demographic dividend that they feel could happen if we make the right human capital investments in the life of young people, that we could actually stimulate economic growth in the region.
So I mean, you mentioned the term demographic dividend there. You mean you've got this bulge of young people who could be incredibly productive. Absolutely. And you'll have more people in the workforce than dependent as children or older people.
Yes.
But if it goes wrong...
And that's a huge opportunity, yeah, if we can harness it effectively. The challenge we have, George did mention the fact about the need to provide education. And in sub-Saharan Africa, I think we have made significant progress in expanding access to primary education. But transition to secondary education has been quite low. And even the quality of the primary education that's being offered is a concern to many. So within that context, it becomes very challenging to actually maximize the benefits that could come from that huge youth population. So for the region as a whole, you look at HIV prevalence. We've made good progress in reducing the prevalence, but The highest new infection rates are highest among young people. And so how do you deal with that? And we are in a region where a lot of the policies are there. You may have the right policies, but the biggest challenge is how do you actually implement the policy effectively? So it's not just having the policy, but as the report also indicated, particularly within the African context and some other low and middle-income countries, you have multiple policies and legal statuses that go on in the countries. You know, you have customary laws, you have religious laws, and many times they take precedence over what the national law and legislation is saying. And this creates challenges in actually implementing the programs for adolescents. So the last thing I would think is, I think it's important that we have good and right policies, but it's more important that those policies are effectively implemented, because that's the only way we can achieve the impact we want to see in terms of improving and sustaining the improvement in the lives of adolescents.
But as you say, those policies can run up against cultural barriers or traditions and so on, and we might come back to that issue as well. Emma.
Firstly, I would like to express the importance of involving young people in the conversation about young people, which is why I'm here today, so thank you for having me. The reason I believe this is important is because no one understands the issues our young people are facing better than the young people themselves, the people that are living these experiences. On that note, I would like to encourage policymakers and people of influence to go out into the community and talk to the people that your policy will be affecting, and continue to invite and encourage everyone to join in on the conversation.
So really, very much what Tess was saying about getting young people involved in designing services and having a say about what they need and what their problems are.
Yeah, exactly. Tess pretty much hit the head on the nail. So.
Yeah. Come.
Hi everybody, thank you for inviting us to be part of this important conversation. I had a couple of points I wanted to make. One was to just name the obvious, which Australia is culturally diverse. We are a multicultural country, and the increase in the youth and adolescents population is primarily based on the fact that we have a large immigration program of which they have to be young. So I think that means that within that context of that report, we also have to recognise that the profile of what an adolescent looks like now and will look like in 10 or 15 years' time is going to be increasingly diverse. So what does that mean for our policy issue? So I would share that the issue around it requires some different thinking about young people, because I'm deeply concerned about the undervaluing of young people in the Australian community and the problematising of them rather than seeing what they contribute. The other really interesting point I thought out of that presentation was also this whole issue about the importance of the peers, and not to underestimate the extent to which the sense of belonging emerges at that time. And if we don't deal with that issue, we have challenges in adulthood. And then finally, I suppose the issue that worries me the most in the Melbourne context is the increasing levels of youth unemployment that we have not seen, and what that says about the generation who don't understand work or had not been given the opportunity before, and the increasing levels of inequality, and what that means for young people's sort of health and wellbeing.
Well, there's lots of themes. Education is a theme here. Gender possibly is a theme here. The migration/refugee experience is a theme here, but also the idea of work. So let's start with work, because, George, if I understood you correctly, you're suggesting that this transition from education to work is part of the transition of becoming an adult, or part of the, formation. And if that is made, if that's not available because the work's not available, we're in trouble, aren't we?
Look, this is absolutely right, Peter. So things have changed, and I look back to my generation, and it was actually easy for my generation. Education was paid for. I actually got paid to go to university. Can you imagine that today? So I had no debt. At the end of it, I had an easy transition into employment. So these things are not available to kids these days in quite the same way. So they have a very different path through their 20s. Some actually do manage to get jobs early on. They're the quick ones, but many are taking a very scenic view through the scenic tour through the 20s, when they encounter all kinds of hazards. So some of those are actually health hazards. So mental health hazards are really linked to a failure to make this transition into employment. substance use and abuse, particularly in young males, in the Australian context, is a huge emerging problem. So yes, this is a health problem, it's a mental health problem. It's also a problem of our education system because, it's a question of employers saying to educators, well, the kids are not coming to us necessarily with the skills that we need. So they're coming perhaps with a set of cognitive skills, but it's actually the social and emotional skills that kids need to be learning for the modern workforce. And obviously, it's complicated again in the sense that we have a globalized economic community now. So our kids are actually here in Australia, they're competing with kids around the globe. And that's many of the jobs that were once available to young Australians, well, they are now sort of being taken by young people around in other countries. So there are many challenges here, I think, for us.
And Carmel, I mean, we've seen, we see a great emphasis in Australia on university education. Are we neglecting the vocational stream, the TAFE and other vocational streams, which seems to get treated as kind of like the poor cousin, and yet for many young people, that's the most likely path into some kind of qualification?
Yep, I certainly believe that the pathway from school to work has been a failure of successive governments in this country. I think that they have been allowed to get away with assuming that you either drop out of school or you go to university, and as if there's nothing in the middle. I had the privilege of being in Berlin in Germany last year and spent 2 weeks visiting their vocational education system, which picks up on issues like what does industry think they need. Industry makes a commitment to taking young people out of the workforce. They are involved in the determination of what the skills are. They are linked to school. It really is a really different way of thinking, and you kind of come back to Australia and say, we've done no thinking about this issue at all. The young people we've got are not ready for the work of the future. And I think the other issue is, as George just highlighted, Australia has been an attractive place for migrants and refugees for business skills. That's going to change in the next 20 or 30 years when the rest of the world is going to be wanting the same people we want, and Australia is going to have a huge skill shortage because we're not training our young people for the future. We're still training them for work that existed 20 years ago.
Emma, can I ask you, you've been in Melbourne now a year and a half or so, but from the Northern Territory. How big an issue is unemployment or the difficulty of finding work for people of your age?
It is difficult for people of my age to find, I think, full-time work, especially obviously just out of school. A lot of young people are expected to either go on to uni straight after school, but that can be a hard thing as well. Like going to uni, me moving away from Darwin, we only have one university in Darwin, so you either do the courses that they offer or you move away from home. So now people like myself are expected to work multiple part-time jobs to support themselves out of home whilst going to uni to hopefully get a full-time job by the end of it. So I think it's a bit of an issue, and it puts more pressure on young people these days to make that happen, I think. Otherwise, sorry, I'll just quickly, otherwise I think young people sort of also are susceptible to getting stuck in this process of having just various part-time jobs and never really having a straightforward career path. That's what I think.
George, did you want to?
Oh, look, I totally agree, and I think that this is something which is a bigger sort of policy issue for us. And it's something which has changed over time. As I said, my generation was the golden generation. We had it all. But somehow successive governments have withdrawn from investing in this age group in the ways that my generation had it. So they're not investing in the same way in education. And they're not investing in the same way in transition into the labour market. So we've got this question, I think, which is beginning to emerge of intergenerational inequity or inequality in this country, where sort of young people coming, they're not able to get a good job. They're not necessarily able to get the training that will equip them for jobs of the future. They're coming out instead with student debt. I've got 4 kids, and they've all got significant debts that they're carrying forward. They haven't even begun to pay them back. But it's a very different scenario, I think, that we're talking about today, and I think that's a policy failure here.
And Alex and Tess, you've worked a lot internationally. How does this issue of work play out in a country like East Timor, where I think 60% of the population are under 25?
And you have absolutely enormous rates of youth unemployment, basically. I think just before we move on to Timor, I would just add, in addition to everything everyone else has said, that internships becoming the norm as a form of getting work here is absolutely absurd. I have a friend who did 12 internships during her degree, unpaid internships, and then still is just, so thankful to get a 6-month contract. So that's the context. So in Timor, absolutely, you have large groups. It's different as well in terms of the main source of their economy. So there is more opportunity in agriculture in Timor. And in terms of the professional sector, you actually have, as in many developing countries in Africa, I'm sure as well, brain drain from Timor because the opportunities just don't exist there. So it's a golden opportunity to be able to study overseas. And then once you are in that overseas country, you might decide to stay there, and then the capacity is not happening in Timor.
Alex?
No, I think it's a real challenge. If you have been to any of the big cities in Africa, you'll see thousands of young people on the streets hawking things. And many times, 70% of the job you will get will be in the informal sector, where you have no benefits whatsoever. And so I think it starts with two things. One is what the point you've made earlier, that our educational system is actually geared to producing people who would need civil service job, not people who can apply their skills to solving problems in their local context and in their environment. And that's one of the discussions we want to have in the region. How can we adapt our educational systems to actually build the right skills in people? If you are in Nairobi, for example, and you have a problem with your plumbing system, electrical system, you either get somebody who may not have completed primary school, has gone through some training to do that, or you get a university graduate. And so in between that, very little, and even when they exist, the market is not structured to give opportunities for that level, mid-level skills that would be needed to support a whole array of opportunities that could exist in the region. So you have an economy that actually would thrive in the informal sector, but you don't have a mechanism of creating those sets of skills. And that's what young people need. They don't want to be hawking their goods around the street. They need skills that they can apply to dealing with things that can give them jobs instantly when they finish. If you go to the US and you call somebody to come and fix your plumber for 1 hour, you know how much you'll be paying for it. But those systems do not exist, and yet there's huge need for them across the region.
And then the casual nature of it reflects security and so on. Let me turn to another topic which came up throughout your initial responses, and that was the question of mental health. Now, it seems to me that in Australia, we are seeing higher levels of mental health problems amongst young people. And my question to anyone on the panel is this: is that because we are now identifying these issues more because other issues have been cleared away, so we're seeing the mental health problems? Or is it in fact that the nature of the society is such that young people are experiencing more mental health problems?
Have a go? Yeah, look, it's both, I think. Peter, I think that there's little doubt that we've become a whole lot more aware of mental disorders as we have got on top of the other health problems that used to affect this age group in this country and still do affect adolescents around the world. But I also think there's a lot of evidence from, not so much from Australia, but from other high-income countries, from the UK, that the mental health of the adolescent years is less good than it used to be 50, 60 years ago.
And why?
I don't think we know the answer to this. We certainly know from the recent Australian survey, national survey of mental health and well-being, that we have this tremendous problem in young women during their adolescent years, very high rates of depression, really almost at epidemic levels. I don't think we sort of really understand, but it's probably something to do with the social environment of these years. These are years where, in terms of development, you need quite a lot of stability in your life. We know that things such as family disruption are really important risk factors for mental health during this age group. We also know that troubles with peers are really important risk factors during this age group. So families, peers have changed profoundly during these years. Our education system has changed as well. So kids are increasingly focused on exams, cognitive outcomes. Our education system has become absolutely focused on PISA scores and NAPLAN, and not actually sort of broader aspects of the social and emotional well-being of kids during these years. So I don't think we know exactly why it is. Social and digital media has profoundly sort of changed development, created incredible opportunities for this generation. You are the most interconnected, knowledgeable generation in many ways, and yet sort of this is the kind of thing which is shaping development in ways that we don't really understand. Our research is lagging sort of so far behind. Our research paradigms, weren't designed for the kinds of change that we've seen, because social media didn't exist until about 10 years ago.
And any other comments on this?
Again, I think George is the best expert on this with his background in psychiatry. But the point I want to make is also, today it's very easy to celebrate success and to see it in social media. You get straight A's, it's posted all over there. If you get an F in the classes, then it's a problem because you're not measuring up. So the pressure is much higher today than it used to be. You don't have to know who is failing or who is passing. You may know a few people, but now in your class, if my kid's in school and you get a B minus, you think it's a failure. And it didn't used to bother many of us that you got a B.
And maybe Emma or Tess might have a comment on this too, but there's also the whole kind of amount of responses you get to Facebook posts or whatever, the likes and all the rest of it. I mean, that must be, there's this kind of constant evaluation process, peer evaluation process going on.
I think that's a very big issue that's arising very recently in today's society, is that young people, are caring too much about the amount of likes they get on Facebook or Instagram or followers and things like that. And it's just sort of become really out of touch from reality social media has. I think it's an issue we need to focus on and look into more, because there isn't much about it.
It's chronic. I was talking to a friend's younger sibling the other day, and she was talking about how at her school it used to be that you needed to appear sort of presentable or wearing the latest brands or whatever during school hours, and then you'd go home from school, you'd have that safe space to relax, to be you, blah blah blah. Now with Instagram, you're expected to be posting photos of the great thing you did after school and on the weekend, and what your outfit was when you were doing that. It's this coupled with that absolute striving for perfection in every realm of life. So you're supposed to look a particular way, you're supposed to get those grades, because if you don't get those grades, then you won't get into university,
And I mean, despite all the interconnectedness that social media brings, it doesn't replace a face-to-face personal engagement, or I would argue this, maybe, from absolutely zero evidence base.
Pete, I just want to comment on that and say that I know from my own son's social networks and the work we do, that what I found so outstanding is what surprises me is that they are the most connected generation, but yet I also feel, is it not right, George, I think reading research about the highest levels of young people identifying as being lonely and alone at the same time. So there's something going on as we extend adolescence into 20s, health issues about we're more connected, but actually, yes, you're right, young people are feeling less connected than they ever have, and are we losing something about that personal connection that used to be taken for granted before, and how do we relearn some of those interactions that were there?
Yeah, look, it's complex, isn't it? Because kids today they've got a lot more connections, but the quality of those connections is different. Yeah. So there's the depth, I think, that Peter was referring to. It's very different, actually. Being face-to-face, proximity, making eye contact. This is a very different kind of interaction that one has, and it does promote, I think as Tess was saying, a certain kind of very shallow interaction. If that comes to dominate at a time when identity is being formed, the effects are likely to be very profound.
So, Carmel, I want to come back to you because one of the other concerns around young people in Australia today is around young people and crime and violence. And particularly in Melbourne right now, a concern around youth gangs and a concern that certain communities, migrant or refugee communities, don't integrate well and are more susceptible or more prone to this type of antisocial behaviour. So what's the evidence tell us about young people and crime and gang activity and so on?
Have we got an hour?
No, but give us the
I'll give you,
the executive summary.
if you could indulge me, I'll give you an overview, because this is an issue I'm very passionate about and I think we need to talk about. So if we start with youth crime is decreasing, but yet there is types of crime that have increased, that are brazen, that are probably seen to be more violent and more visible in the community. But
So you're saying the overall level of youth
Yes.
crime is going down, but there are particular categories of perhaps violent or brazen crime
that are in the public eye, and that you have a small recidivist group that are committing a high degree of crime. So it's not like we've got thousands of young people across Melbourne committing all these crimes and people should be really petrified. But if one reads some local paper, that's what you're led to believe. But yes, there is an increase in some much more visible crimes, but you would think that the young people committing the crime are all of one particular ethnic group, when in reality, out of all the house burglaries, public crimes we've heard about, 70% of them have been committed by young people who were born in Australia. But if you read the local paper, you would not know that figure, I suspect. You'd be thinking that 70% of them are actually African young people. That's not the reality. But yes, there are young people of African backgrounds, like many different ethnic backgrounds, committing those crimes. So we put that on the table. The second issue is that we also, historically, have had cohorts of young people from different migration groups who have been visibly committing crime. I'm Italian. I understand I wasn't one of them, but my generation were engaging them. I worked with Vietnamese young people from Southeast Asia in the 90s, highly visible crimes. It's a period of history, but now we see that community has integrated into civil society quite well. But if you picked up a paper from probably 1998, like we've been doing some research on, you could look at it today and think the same thing's going on. So I think you have to put a bit of that in context as well. But finally, maybe, I understand the fear and I understand the community fear, and something has to be done about the changing nature of crime, and I think probably more importantly about the way we are dealing with young people committing crime.
And you said in there that there's that actually it's a fairly small cohort of young people who are engaged in these repeat crimes. So what's happened to that group? I mean, are these just bad apples, or what? How do we understand their behaviour?
Yeah, it's a really complex issue. There are a group of them who are highly damaged young people historically who have been committing crime from a young age. Then there are other groups.
So highly damaged, you say they've had very
out
bad...
of home care, sexual abuse, family. I sit on the youth parole board. Most of you would not want to hear the stories that I hear on a regular basis about what society has done to some of the young people who are interfacing with the criminal justice system, and I think we have to remember that a lot of them are coming from very damaged backgrounds. That doesn't excuse the crime, but it is an indicator of why young people get involved in crime. But then there is a new group who are much older, engaging in crime for the first time that we haven't seen, and I don't think our justice system has come to terms with the fact that we need to deal with this group differently. We actually have to look to do things differently. We can't rely on what we're doing, and certainly we do not lock them up. Locking them up is not going to make any difference. But at the moment, in this public debate, evidence has no weight. I'm sorry, George, but I think that's what's happening, that researchers spend a whole lot of time giving us evidence, and government doesn't like to have evidence. They'd rather go with what they think needs to be done. So the rest of the world, places like Texas, Dallas, are closing jails. In Victoria, we want to open more of them.
Emma, I wanted to come to you here because, of course, what we see in around Australia, particularly in the Northern Territory where you come from originally, is who gets locked up? It's young Indigenous kids.
Yeah. I think the issue with the youth justice system in Australia at the moment is appalling to me. I agree that detention, like youth detention centres, is not the answer. Locking young people up is not going to solve the issues. It's going to create more issues. What I do believe in is a strengths-based approach. We are talking about the most important development stage of these kids' life, and what the current system is doing is just breaking these young people down into nothing in the system and then sending them out into the real world and sort of expecting them to live as functional human beings when really they're not anymore after they come out. So what I think we need to be focusing on is helping young people build on their strengths and helping them develop and learn in a safe space rather than trying to fix their weaknesses through forms of punishment and further traumatising them. I also think we need to look through the pipeline and focus on helping the broken communities that these children are coming from. When I say this, I'm sort of talking about Indigenous communities in the Northern Territory. I think the most prominent case of the youth juvenile detention, like a child in youth juvenile detention in the Northern Territory, is a child that's been taken away from their home, gone through the foster care system, and then eventually ending up in the youth justice system. So I think we need to focus on what causes this and also what's happening in these communities. We need to go to these communities, work with the people in these communities to solve these problems and help the kids that we're failing. We are all failing. So.
Georgia, the point Emma made there, that in your presentation you talked about how crucial this time is in our formation as human beings, and then if you spend that time in a youth detention centre or indeed in an adult jail, possibly in Victoria at the moment, what effect does this have?
Absolutely huge. So I absolutely agree with your comments. This is a group of kids who are coming with a whole lot of disadvantages: family background, educational background, out-of-home care, and our systems aren't working for this group of kids. And we need to be thinking about adolescence. We need to be thinking about it as a second chance for these kids. It's the last chance they're probably going to get to actually get some of those skills that are going to be really important in life. And we're not giving it to them. So our education systems, these kids often have a history of the education system failing them. They've got a history of being out of school, changing schools. We're not getting sort of those settings right in terms of protective care. Our protective care system tends to cut out from about the age of 16 or even a bit before for a lot of these kids. And that's when they're actually reaching the most vulnerable time for this group of kids. So they transition from protective care to youth justice. And that isn't a system which is focusing on what it needs to focus on, the positives. Actually, how do we actually build assets for this group of kids? How do we build their capabilities for life? That's where we need to be focusing. It needs to be a second chance that we're creating. We're not.
So on that, can I ask George on that, because it's frustrating as a practitioner to know that there is a dearth of research that's reinforcing what you're saying, George, but yet we can't have a discourse like that. Like this research information, I think even if it's shared, is not going to be listened to because there is no appetite to see the importance of investing in adolescence. It feels like it's a forgotten generation.
Yeah, look, and I think this is something to do with the siloed nature of bureaucratic systems. Youth justice has had a completely different frame to the education system and the health system. They haven't come together for this group of kids. They need to be able to come together, but nobody's interested in working at that interface. Same thing with health and education. Those systems need to work hand in glove, but they don't. Look, it's the culture of youth justice has been a challenging one. We've tried actually to do research in the setting. It's been really tough because there's a sense of any news is bad news for the justice system. They actually don't necessarily want to know about the awful life outcomes. So this is a group where sort of if you look at mortality rates in the youth justice system, they're about 50 times higher than kids in the community. They're dying from utterly preventable causes, so they're sort of accidental injury, drug overdoses, suicide are the causes of death in this group. These are rates that you would see sort of probably in some of the countries, the lowest income countries on the planet. These would be the kinds of death rates that you would actually see in places like Lesotho, where you have problems with HIV. So this is a scandal, but it's one that we're not actually getting the message to government. So again, it comes back to that question of we need government to work across government to actually get it right for this group of kids, more than any other.
Just very quickly, and one of the things we also have seen many times is that when you have policies that are specifically targeting marginalized groups or poor populations, they are often very poor policies, poorly thought out and poorly implemented and poorly funded. And if one is going to deal with these issues, there needs to be a very concrete decision to invest appropriately and to find real solutions that will work for that population.
Now, look, there's a couple of microphones in the two centre aisles there. If you've got a question you'd like to ask them, please make your way to the microphone, and I'll invite your questions in a sec. The other tension that I wanted to raise with you as all the panel is this, and Testament, you might want to respond first, and that is, on the one hand, we say we want young people to have more of a voice and be more engaged and make their own decisions, but on the other, we're concerned about easy access to alcohol. We're trying to, make sure that we don't advertise tobacco. In fact, we're actually trying to influence kids' choices, young people's choices in certain directions. Is there a tension here between giving autonomy and actually controlling choices or influencing choices?
I think the report calls it, I really like that, autonomy enhancing paternalism, which I think is a great expression. It's basically the idea that you can support youth or adolescents to develop the problem-solving skills to make informed decisions, based on the idea that adolescents typically make decisions based on the short term rather than the long-term consequences, and so the idea that you can support them to do that. I think in the same way that you would talk about mental health consumers or people with disability, the Convention of the Rights of People with Disability would say that just because someone might not have full capacity doesn't mean that they shouldn't be supported to do that. And that's absolutely my...
And it's also frameworks of things like, I remember my son, I think he was 15 at the time, pointing out to me that he could buy 5 litres of Golden Oak, I think it's called. Anyway, it's 5 litres of cheap white wine for $10, cheaper than he could buy 5 litres of water. And you think, well, this doesn't really make a lot of public policy sense, does it? Let's take the first question here, thanks.
Hi, Colin Stokes from Y Foundations up in Sydney. I was thinking about, George, your slide of the Buddhist monks and the Guatemalan gang members, and I was thinking about the fact that all of the young people that I have associated with, whether they're closer to the Guatemalan example than the Buddhist example, would describe themselves as following a fairly strong moral code, and that they carry this really importantly inside them. And also the fact that the young people that I work with, when I do give them the responsibility to, say, come up with some peer education material, a poster around sexual health for their mates or those sort of things, that they take those responsibilities quite seriously underneath this moral code that they've got around responsibilities. And in context of that gap where the responsibilities of parenthood are receding and they're sort of around there wanting to do stuff, what should we be giving young people to do to give them responsibilities, to make them or to invite them to respond to the problems that we've created for them?
And how do you challenge a moral code that might be a troubling moral code, I guess, of a gang code?
Indeed, it's certainly worth thinking about, but I think it's about how to harness that commitment to a code, whatever that be.
Yeah. Look, it's a fabulous question. There are a number of elements in there, and I totally agree with you. Those Guatemalan gang members, they have a moral code. And it's about allegiance to each other. It's allegiance to the gang. And it's a strong code. It's one that shapes everything about them. But as Peter was saying, in a helpful way. I think, I'd be sort of acting with that gang to provide opportunities before they join the gang. Because I think by then it's probably too late in many ways. And they'll sort of go through the life cycle of being in the gang, and they will survive or they won't. There's a phenomenon called the offending menopause. Alan, you'll be perhaps familiar with it, for sort of young people in the justice system. At about the age of 28, 29, many young men decide this is not a life they want to actually continue, and they...
Well, young people generally grow out of law-breaking behaviour.
Not all.
No.
But some do actually go through the offending menopause. So this question of how do we engage young people, I think, is part of the question. Well, I think we've got to take a different view of young people. It's been something that's been troubling me, I think, through the whole conversation, that we've created this environment of young people as something to be feared. My youngest son, when he was about 14, he also had a big growth spurt, and He was walking down the street with me one day, and it was in sort of a nice neighbourhood queue. And he said to me, "That lady just walked away from me. She was afraid of me." Now, he's a nice kid, actually, but it was this sense of he was observing that he was a threatening object to this woman. And this is something to do with the bad press that this age group gets. This is an age where we should be engaging. It's an age where I talked about it being an age of creativity and discovery. It's of the light side. And we will benefit from that engagement ourselves as older people. But we're not putting in place the systems to do this. We're not training young people about how to engage. I often talk, we worked with some fabulous youth advocates. They had a decade of speaking at forums like this one here. And Tess, for example, didn't wake up one morning and say, "I've got all the skills to become an advocate." She's had to learn them. She's just been in America, sort of at this high-level forum, which sounds fantastic. But it's taken a long time. We're not actually training young people in these skills, which are actually the same skills that are important in being successful in life, successful in work. So it's about how to communicate. It's about us learning to listen. It's about us creating forums for young people where they can be heard. This is a forum where we actually are hearing sort of from young people. We need a lot more of that. And we need to be resourcing young people in this kind of role. We tend in this country, as in many other countries, to do token engagement. We need to be doing it much more systematically. And I'd be saying this is something where, in terms of the education system, we need to be starting this in primary school.
Other responses? Anyone else want to jump in here?
I've just spent all day at a youth summit, I suppose you'd call it, for the Sustainable Development Goal Youth Network, which is entirely run by youth. It connects youth working across the whole world on sustainable solutions. It's absolutely incredible. Some of the innovations that people were talking about, one in particular was in Nairobi. They were using recycled e-waste to create the plastic to then be fed into a 3D printer to then create microscopes for the local people to use in their labs at a low cost. And that was a 20-year-old doing that. So I think it's pairing these incredible ideas that for creativity and innovation with people who can mentor that and can guide that and also can provide the funding to back it.
Yeah, resources.
Okay, we'll take the next question.
Hi, thanks. It's Megan Lim from the Burnett Institute. I think it's great you're just talking about really positive things, but I'm just going to ask about a negative thing. I wanted to ask about gender inequality and attitudes to violence against women in particular. So it seems like for the last few decades, these attitudes have been getting better and better, but sort of recent research seems to show that the current generation of adolescents, it's sort of been a bit of a shift back towards more negative attitudes. So more unequal attitudes to gender and more support of violence against women. I was wondering if you think this is a real phenomenon that's happening globally, why you think it is, and what we can do about it, I guess.
Okay, so it's a big question on gender relationships and attitudes towards women and whether there was progress being made and whether it's now slipping back as attitudes change. I don't know if that's Australian research or if that's but whether this, not just in Australia but globally, is a phenomenon.
I think there's a great deal, sorry, I can't see you anymore, speaker.
Me.
There's a great deal of complacency. I mean, the fact that we have young women on the stage talking about their opinions is sort of like, great, job well done. But the more insidious belief in women's abilities and entitlement, sexualization of girls from a very young age, models being 14 but acting like they're 20, all those sort of contributing factors. But that in the general population of Australia, because we generally are much better off than we were, it's sort of like this, it's time to focus on men, which I'm not saying that men aren't important in this debate, but it's about seeing the entitlements to equality for women as not like a zero-sum commodity, meaning that you have to take away from men per se to give rights to women.
Alex, this must have a particular manifestation for you in Nairobi and in Africa more generally, because I mean you talk about things well, you mentioned, women having children very young, teenage pregnancies, child marriage or marriage at very young ages. These are the kind of issues that I think are most concerning for you, right?
Yeah, those are real issues. I think for Africa, we've made some progress in terms of gender equality in a number of areas, but there's still a long way to go. If you look at even access to secondary school and the transition from primary to secondary, it is very low for girls compared to boys, despite all the efforts to being implemented to encourage the girl child to go to school. The constitution, for example, in Kenya mandates that 1/3 of the political positions should be for women. But of all the 47 governors in the country currently, there is no female governor. So you have the policies, and again, that's the point we made earlier. Sometimes you have the right policies and even guaranteed by the constitution, but how do you implement it and how do you ensure these things? So it's a continuous struggle, and in many ways, that struggle is continuing. Issues of female genital is still a major challenge. Early marriage, I mean, in some parts, you still see age at first marriage legally at 15, 16. And so there are we still have a long way to go in being able to ensure we put the right policies and the right programs in place to achieve real gender equality in the region.
Okay, we'll take another question from this side this time.
My name is Stephen Ginsburg. I'm from the Sydney North Primary Health Network. I'm a GP. In this hall yesterday, we had a wonderful presentation on suicide prevention in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. And it would be invidious of me to, as a white fella, to praise what they said, but it was an emphasis on return to culture and helping these people, young people and older people, recognize their culture. What is our culture? Do we have a culture? And it seems to me we're charged in the Primary Health Network now to try and prevent youth suicide. And youth suicide goes across class and income. So what is our culture, if that's going to be the way
that's a really nice, easy question. Carmel, I'm going to give it to you. So,
Yes,
I mean,
just in a couple of minutes.
Yeah.
Oh, goodness.
So, I mean, the idea that, okay, actually our mental health, I think if I can summarise the point, would be our mental health, or young people's mental health, general mental health, is partly going to be stronger if it's based in culture, in a sense of culture. But if we don't know what our culture is, what do we do?
Yep, it's a really good question, and in my context, because I can't speak about Indigenous communities, but the young people I work with who are dealing with what now are multicultures that we're dealing with. It's no longer your bicultural, it's about the kind of nation we've become. It's about finding your identity, and I think it's really true. It's that I don't know how well society and we as adults are very good anymore at supporting young people to transition through that process and come out the other way, like people like I did. You know, I was Italian generation. I thought I was Italian until I visited Italy in my 20s and came back to Australia going, oh, I am definitely not Italian. But I went through that experience myself and have reconciled who that I am. We're now in a globalised world where some of the young people we work with have got connections all over the world and kind of say, this is the kind of young person I am, and where is my place, and how good has society got at dealing with this new, identities young people have got. And then the other thing I think that's important, I sat on a committee with the state government looking at youth suicide, and I think there is something to be said about what we as a society are also doing to give men the right or the skills to ask for help, because it is predominantly more a young male than female, not to say it's not, but it's about how we help and how does the mental health sector help young people, because that's where they're likely to go for help if they're struggling. And I'm not sure what the answer to that is, but I think that's the struggle we have now.
Emma, yeah, please.
Add to that. I think, yeah, I totally agree with the questionnaire. And I think young Indigenous people today, there is a really big issue about identity and cultural identity, and I think a lot of young Indigenous Australians are really lost in that, which they have trouble with their own culture and like identifying with what their culture entails really. So I think we do need to facilitate and support more programs that help young people sort of learn more about their own identity and more about their place in the world and what they want to do with their life, because I think for a lot of young people it's just a really fuzzy picture. An example of one of these programs is a program that I went through and it's being run in the Northern Territory in WA. It's called the Impact Program and it's run through Foundation for Young Australians. So basically the program runs for 3 years, so it's really a really long-term supportive program through years 10, 11 and 12, and it aims to provide stronger peer support networking, strengthen cultural identity and develop leadership skills in young people. The most important thing about this program is that it's run by Indigenous people. I think that's one of the most important takeaways from that, is that when coming up with new initiatives and solutions to these things, that we're really consulting with Indigenous people if it's for Indigenous youth, and youth if it's for youth sort of thing.
Alex,
Yeah, I think it's really important to also relook at culture. My culture is not actually the culture of my children. My kids, I was born in Nigeria, I grew up in Nigeria, I left Nigeria when I was in my mid-20s and then spent some 10 years in the US and another 18 and a half, 19 years in Kenya. So they were born in the US, they have Nigerian parents, and they grew up in Kenya. And when you think about their worldview and what it is that is informing it, it's not the same as mine, and it's recognizing that difference and being able to allow them understand what their culture is and how they can effectively live it and maximize that opportunity. So if I wanted them to behave as I behaved growing up, it will never work. So it's recognizing what are they identifying with and what is their reality that really is important to them and supporting them in that process.
and George?
Well, yeah, look, it's very much the point that Alex is making. That I'd sort of turn it around and actually say that this is an incredible opportunity that this generation have to connect with different cultures and actually assume almost different identities. It's the point that I think Kamal was making. Yeah, Amartya Sen has written about this and say we live in a world which is incredibly rich. Culture makes it rich. And yes, I would totally agree with you that for young Indigenous people, connection with culture, connection with land, connection with language is really essential to having an identity which is a sound identity moving forward. And they have lost a lot, Indigenous communities, in terms of that connection with language, with culture. I think it's an essential part of Indigenous policy, that is something that Indigenous communities are helped to rebuild.
Okay, we'll take a question here. Yeah.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Jomer from Queensland, and I'm actually an international student from the Philippines. So I just have a question and a comment. So my comment is it's really true that education is really an important factor, specifically for adolescent moms, particularly in Philippines, because when moms get pregnant, there's actually a policy gap in which after they get pregnant, are there policies or programs that will support them to continue their education? So it's really important. And my question is, do you have any thoughts about how can we ensure that the program models that we're developing as of this stage is actually sustainable and applicable for adolescents on 2030? Because as we can see, adolescents evolve across time, and probably, I don't know, the programs that we're developing now might not be applicable for the adolescents of after 10 years. Yep.
Okay, so interesting question. How do we develop programs that are going to be relevant to the next generation of adolescents who may be quite different? Tess, is this where actually the kind of co-design process of engagement comes in, do you think?
Absolutely. Brilliant question. I think from a pragmatic perspective, the chance that you're getting funding for 10 years is pretty unlikely. So you will be genuinely rejigging your program as you go. I suppose proper evaluation done throughout the implementation of a program means that you should be picking up when programs are being taken up and why they are and possibly why they're not. It's about involving the beneficiaries of the program involved, in the process. So as we get older, the new adolescent voice comes in and replaces that to inform any program or policy. But you're right, I hadn't thought of it before.
And the other aspect of that question was about education. I think, George, one of the key recommendations in your report is simply more secondary education for more young people around the world.
Let me just qualify that. It's about quality secondary education. Education, educationists are probably teachers in the audience, but I'm probably going to offend now, so apologies ahead of time. But quality education has become synonymous with how you do academically. It's in terms of cognitive skills. So the newspapers, when PISA scores come out here in this country, are about how badly Australians are faring, young Australians are faring. And that's been really an obsessive, almost concern of become an obsessive concern of education. But education has to be about much more than that. It's got to be about sort of the skills, the attributes that you actually need for life. And I don't think we've got that right. So one thing that I think is really important in terms of sustainability is actually getting, again, our systems of government working sort of more effectively together. So if you're talking about lower and middle income countries, getting the interface between health and education is really critical. And yet, sort of health and education do not work together in those countries by and large. So, for example, we talked about the failure of transition to secondary school. Why is that, particularly for girls? Well, it's about things like water and sanitation. So absence of any facilities of sanitation in many schools for girls. So no toilets, no facilities for menstrual hygiene. So girls, if they do get to school, they miss a lot of school, but often they just decide it's all too difficult and I'm actually going to drop out. That's a health issue. There are many other health issues, anemia, that actually affect education performance, particularly of girls. But systems don't come together. Sort of health is out here, education is out here. Education says, well, that's health's responsibility to fund the interface. Health says that's education's responsibility, whereas if you actually put the systems together, the whole is so much greater than the two parts. But we don't seem to get that right. We don't seem to get it right here. We don't seem to get it right everywhere. But it's a key to actually sustainable education.
Alex?
Yeah, just very quickly, I think the issue of constant review of curriculum is really quite important. The curriculum that may be appropriate for today, in 10, 15 years, with the way things are changing, may be completely irrelevant to the needs of society. So if we can put in, and one of the things that's rarely ever reviewed is curriculum. In many African countries, we still have what we got in the 60s and 70s. And it is completely out of date with current reality. So we need to have a mechanism of looking at these things and adapting them as we go on. The programs we develop today may not be irrelevant in 2020, 2025. So to think 30 years ahead, we have to continually re-engineer those programs to respond to the needs of adolescents in that time period.
Okay, now, because we started a bit later, I'm going to go a few minutes over just so we can get these last two questions in. So I'll invite your question. Thanks for your patience.
Hi, my name's Melinda. I work for the Alcohol and Drug Foundation, but I'm also more relevant here because I am the parent to 3 teenagers who fit into this category. My concern or my comment is more about this whole idea of academic excellence, and I'm wondering whether the academic excellence that we're driving with our kids is at it's neglecting their creativity and neglecting their imagination, and how that actually impacts on risk taking. So we've always talked about adolescents wanting to take risks, and it's the time where they can take risks. But my concern is that by pushing the academic excellence line, we're actually narrowing that focus of what we consider risk taking. We know here in Australia that the rates of young people using substances is decreasing, but where is that risk now being taken up upon, and how is that going to play out in future years? So that concept, I think that how are we driving up these anxiety levels because we're reducing the capacity for young people to make risky decisions, and risky decisions doesn't have to be drinking, using substances. It can be taking an academic risk or taking a risk with an imagination.
Okay. Anyone want to jump into this? It's a comment as much as a question. I think it's an observation, a very interesting observation. And I would throw in there moral education as well as the imagination and creativity. Any other?
Well, look, I'll just jump in. Look, you learn by making mistakes, and adolescents need to have an opportunity to make mistakes, but do so in a protective environment. So the notion of the social scaffold for adolescents is one that we actually introduced in the Commission report. And I think we need to be asking, what does a social scaffold look like? Which is at the one time allowing and empowering adolescents to take exactly the risks that you're talking about, to make mistakes, but also to learn from those mistakes, make those mistakes safely. And I agree with you. I don't think we're doing this well.
Okay, last question, thank you.
Hi, thank you very much for all your comments. It's really great. My name's Rebecca. I'm from Resilient Melbourne. So we're a project that comes out of the Rockefeller Foundation, and we work across all 32 local governments. I guess, you know, our project looks at urbanisation and globalisation and climate change, and obviously these are big issues that are going to affect young people. Some of those issues include kind of disaster management, and we know that communities that are really well connected do a lot better out of those times. And I'm just thought I'd ask a really easy question to finish off, but if there was a silver bullet, how would you like to see government connect with young people to strengthen their communities? And you know, what I think there's a real opportunity to harness that, but I'd love to hear your thoughts if you have any awesome suggestions.
Okay, so this is it's a nice way to finish off. Thank you for the question. You know, I guess if I can rephrase it, how would you like to see each of you governments work together to strengthen connection between young people and the rest of the society? What would be the most important thing? Who wants to start? Yeah, Emma.
I think one of the most important things is for the government to speak in a language that young people are going to understand and that young people are going to connect with and want to be involved with. I think a lot of young people see government policy, or they see speeches and things that politicians are doing, and they don't really understand what they're talking about or what impacts that's going to have on them. So quite simply, I think, sort of speak our language and we will speak with you.
It's a trap for politicians, though, because if they try to be cool and speak the way young people do, they're going to get it really wrong.
Maybe don't try too hard, but just a little bit.
Yeah, better communication, certainly, Okay. Carmel?
A couple of things. I think that it would be good if we, like we started to in other things, try to get bipartisan support from all forms of government, that young people were valued, respected, and voices need to be heard. And that I think the same as we've started work on bystanders stepping in around racism, I think we need to stop thinking that young people can do this on their own, and adults around them, whether it's the scaffolding. I love that term, George. I'm going to take that away and do some reading. The scaffolding around young people, which means probably all of you as parents, adults, uncles, aunties, being there to support the voice of young people to be heard. We can't expect them to actually do this on their own.
Alex?
For me, I would think that realizing that there is no investment we make in young people, that a society and the country as a whole will not be able to reap back many times over. So investments in young people is the wisest investment. I think this report underscores that. And I don't think we are doing enough of it. If we can actually look at our budgets and say what proportion of it is actually going to youth-specific initiatives relative to the size of the youth population in that country, we might be a starting point to really beginning that meaningful engagement with young people. If we said we care for them, that care needs to be reflected in our national budgets in the terms of investments we make.
So we could do some kind of budget auditing which looked at where the money's going and says, well, look, here's this youth, this group of adolescents, are we committing enough money to them? It's a you know, you can even do the sums, as it were, and say, yep. Okay. George, Tess?
Do you want to go first?
No, go. Oh, I'll be short. I would say, in addition to what everyone's spoken about before, intersectoral collaboration between your Ministry of Health and your education, etc. But I would question your question and say that does that have to come exclusively from government? I see the power of the civil society, the NGO sector, but it's also about the most sustainable solutions won't be funded from a top-down order. It will come from grassroots movements. And of course, government funding or other sources to support that. But I think that for me is the starting point. It's about how we relate to each other, how we are positioned in our community, and how we can strengthen that in order to have a sustainable impact.
George. Look, you asked about a silver bullet, and we were giving sort of social and digital media a hard time sort of earlier, but actually I think that one of the silver bullets that we do have is the power of social and digital media to engage with this generation. And I think that's where government could be doing things really differently. There are some fantastic projects out there sort of illustrating how that engagement might actually work around things such as the urban environment and design of the urban environments. Examples using programs that I don't know how to use them, but Minecraft, for example, around getting young people engaged in designing the physical, the social environment in which they're living. And that'll make it a better place, not only for them, but for all of us. So that would be my silver bullet.
Okay, look, thank you all very much for attending this evening. I would commend to you the Lancet Commission report, which you can easily find online if you'd like to read it. There's a whole website devoted to it too, so plenty more resources out there for you if you want to take that further. If you're new to Melbourne Conversations and you'd like to know more about Melbourne Conversations or be kept in touch with future events, then just look up Melbourne Conversations online and you can sign up and get the regular newsletter that will invite you to events. And my thanks to the team at the City of Melbourne and to the 15th World Congress on Public Health for making this possible, in particular Professor Helen Kelleher, who is the convener of the Congress. And thanks above all to our speakers, George Patton, Tess Hall, Alex Eze, Emma Calloway and Carmel Guerra. Thank you very much.
Thank you.